Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this archive event by World Jewish Relief. This is the third presentation by World Jewish Relief in our adult education program, the previous ones being the Jews of Ukraine and Jewish life in Poland in January and March 2016. These events reflected the current work of World Jewish Relief, which now acts as the British Jewish Community's international humanitarian agency. But in the past, from 1933 onwards, it was called the CBF, the Central British Fund for German Jewry, and its work revolved around rescuing people from Europe in the 1930s and 40s, including many of the 10,000 children who came on the Kindertransport, thousands of men who came to the Kitchener camp, and 732 child survivors from concentration camps known as the Boys. Tonight, Rebecca Singer, the Communications Officer at World Jewish Relief, is going to tell us about the records for the people who survived and the way in which they have been digitalised. The files trace the help given by World Jewish Relief in bringing individuals to Britain and assisting them to survive and establish their lives here. Rebecca previously worked as a broadcast journalist at BBC, making business programmes for Radio 5 Live, Radio 4 and the World Service, and still produces religious leaders on Radio 2's faith programme, Pause for Thought. She studied history at the University of Edinburgh.
Thank you so much for having me here this evening. My name is Rebecca Singer, and I am the Head of Communications and Community Engagement at World Jewish Relief. It's especially poignant to be at Edgware United Synagogue because Rabbi Lister was one of the first people that I met when I started working for World Jewish Relief. And he had found his mother's archive documents in our astonishing archive, which over the past 2 years I have had the enormous privilege of getting to know quite intimately. I've met the most amazing people who have the most amazing family histories and stories that very often they haven't known about until they found documents in our archives. So tonight, I just want to give you a brief overview about what our archives are and how you might be able to help us get more people to find their family histories and also to spread the word to other people about what these amazing documents hold. So I'm not sure how much each of you might know about World Jewish Relief, and so I thought that I might start with just a very brief video that gives a very quick overview of the charity today.
World Jewish Relief is a UK charity that's been saving Jewish lives since 1933. We helped rescue over 65,000 Jews from Europe before World War II, including almost 10,000 vulnerable children who travelled on the Kindertransport to Britain's shores, as well as 730 child survivors from concentration camps. A whole generation grew up safely here. And today we're committed to helping every generation escape poverty and prejudice wherever they live. Our focus is on the former Soviet Union, where many of the world's poorest Jewish communities struggle to feed their families. We're helping the unemployed and disabled to find work and a place in society so they can support themselves and the next generation. Putting a roof over their heads and warm food on the tables of the older generation is also an essential part of the work we do, helping them to live out their lives with dignity, free from loneliness and persecution. And when international disasters strike, we're there to offer immediate assistance to those within and beyond the Jewish community, as well as providing long-term solutions to help them rebuild for future generations. The Jewish values we were all brought up with are behind all the work we do. With your support, we can continue to save lives by changing lives for good.
Whenever I speak about World Jewish Relief and our history, I always start with the proviso that, yes, I did study history, but I am by no means an academic historian. And very often when I look around the rooms where I'm speaking, there are people who have actually lived through the events that I'm going to be talking about. So if there is something that you think is factually incorrect, or if you have something to add, then please do speak to me afterwards, because it is a huge learning process and it would be wonderful to hear what you have to contribute. But let me take you back to 1933. And a man called Hitler had just come to power in Germany, and the Jews of Europe were not entirely sure of what he was going to do. They knew what he wanted to do and what he intended to do, but whether he would actually be able to achieve it was another question. But certainly there were some prominent British Jews in Britain at the time who looked at Germany and thought that if Hitler went through with what he wanted to do, then the Jews of Germany were in a lot of trouble. You might recognize some of the names up here. You've got the likes of Simon Marx, who was part of the Marks and Spencer's family. You had Chaim Weizmann, who went on to hold quite a prominent position in the State of Israel. You had Rabbi Hertz, who phenomenally was the chief rabbi between the two world wars. And you had Robert Whaley Cohen, who held a position in Shell Oil at the time. And then Anthony and Lionel de Rothschild as well. There were also some prominent women who were part of this group. And what they did was that they got together and they did two things. They lobbied the British government to allow Jews to come into Britain, as long as they had no recourse on public funds. So the next thing that they had to do was raise a tremendous amount of money, and they did so. In the first year, in 1933, they raised £250,000, which in today's equivalent sterling is approximately £17 million. And in that way, they were able to bring over Jews from Nazi Germany into Britain. And so from 1934, really, Jews started to arrive. And how they raised all this money is always of great interest to us, because we think, well, gosh, if they could do that, imagine what we could do today. But they did use some methods which I think our fundraising team would love to be able to employ, but probably wouldn't get through the Charity Commission regulations these days. If you take a look at this was published in the JC at the time. Have you done your share? It is your duty to give generously to the Central British Fund for German Jewry. Contributions to date amount to 74,816, 4 and 11. And then, I don't know if you can see it too clearly, I'll just point it out. What you can see is the different monetary amounts that people donated. So it starts, I think, at about £2,000, and it lists the person who gave that. And then it goes down and down. I think the last one is about 2 shillings. And it lists everyone who has donated. And it says the need is still very great. See that your name is in next week's paper. But the idea was that everyone in the British Jewish community should be donating to support their brethren in Germany and to help them escape. And that's what they were able to do. And throughout the 1930s, as different laws in Germany were enacted and different restrictions were put on the lives of Jews living in Germany, the rates of immigration from Nazi Europe rose and fell. But really, it was Kristallnacht in 1938 and the Anschluss of Austria where we saw a really big increase again. And this was the pogrom that took place throughout Germany and also Austria and saw the destruction of thousands of Jewish businesses and synagogues. And at that point, not only the Jewish community in Britain, but people around the world were woken up to the fact that Nazi Germany was intending to make life very, very difficult for the Jews. And at that point, 2 of the founders of the Central British Fund, along with some other members from the Jewish community, went to meet with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and asked him to let the children in, to allow them in without passports and without visas. And that was within a few days of Kristallnacht happening. And then a couple of days later, organisations like the Quakers got involved as well. And through Sir Samuel Hoare, who was the Home Secretary at the time, and different organisations, they were able to arrange for the matter to be put to Parliament. And within, I think, about 2 weeks of Kristallnacht, an agreement was sent through Parliament to allow the children to come over, but again, without recourse to public funds. The two concessions that were made was that they could come without passports and without visas. Two bureaucratic documents that would hold up the rescue of all these children. So if Kristallnacht happened on the 9th and 10th of November, within 3.5 weeks, the first Kindertransport train arrived at Harwich in the UK. And between December 1938 and September 1939, approximately 10,000 children were brought over in that way. The Central British Fund raised, again, phenomenal amounts of money from the Jewish community, but also there was the Sir Baldwin Fund, the Lord Baldwin Fund, which was opened up to raise money from the rest of the British community as well. And what happened was that you had Jewish refugee committees set up all around the country. So when these children were brought in, they were housed with families or in foster homes across the United Kingdom. One of the very famous ones is in Dorking in Surrey, which was set up by E.M. Forster. And they took children in, and they very often were treated like their own family, and sometimes they were not treated as nicely. And there are huge variations in experience, but I think the one thing that really comes through is the trauma of separation that very often these children coped with and hid while they were young, but certainly they might not have spoken about for many, many years, or they might have spoken about many years later. So when the refugees came over throughout the 1930s, and the Kindertransport children as well in 38, 39, documents were kept on them because the Central British Fund was not just a rescue organisation, it also became a social and welfare organisation. Because the one thing that the Central British Fund had relied on was that these people coming out of Germany and Austria would bring their money with them, and they didn't. So they had to be supported. And it was the Central British Fund which was that organisation. And at points throughout the war, it looked like it was going to run out of money. And it just about managed to keep its head above water. There were a huge number of people who were keeping files on all these refugees that were coming over. And the most meticulous notes were kept. And after the war, there was a call for them to be destroyed. They were no longer needed and they were going to be disposed of. And I read a beautiful letter in the AJR Journal from a woman who said that my father was working at the Central British Fund. He was asked to dispose of all these documents, and he looked at them and he thought that these were historically important and they should be kept. So for years they were kept in basements, in garages, and finally, about 3 or 4 years ago, we received funding to digitize them. So we have hundreds of thousands of registration cards and tens of thousands of documents, the originals of which are kept in the London Metropolitan Archives. And we have also been fortunate enough to recruit the most phenomenal team of archive volunteers. And they are the ones that have really reunited all these families with their documents. I just wanted to go through some of the documents. I know Rabbi Lister will be talking about some of the ones that he got. This one, I believe you might recognize. These are registration cards, and so these are sometimes the only documents that we have left. The Central British Fund rescued approximately 65,000 people during the 1930s and 40s, including some of the 10,000 children on the Kindertransport and the 732 of the boys who came over after the war. And I know that you're doing mental arithmetic and it doesn't quite add up to 100,000, but we have over 100,000 of these registration cards because people used them as search cards, or people used them to fill in details of their family back home before they had been able to get a visa. So very often what we find is that these registration cards exist for people who never actually made it out of Nazi Europe. And they can be as poignant as the ones that record the fate of those who were saved. You can see just up the top, very often people's names changed. So it changed from formerly Lukowitz and it changed to Lee. It gives an arrival date, a date of birth. It also gives formally the movement. In the top right-hand corner you can see, and that refers to the movement of children from Germany, which the Kindertransport came to be known, because it wasn't until the 1980s that the term Kindertransport really started to be used. It also gives a file number on the top left-hand side, which relates to these files. Only about 30,000 of the files still exist because they were lost, destroyed, or damaged over the many years. And there are some beautiful details about these cards. And I think very often people think looking at documents, it's very hard to see the story behind it. But I just want to walk you through some of the stories that I've learnt about in the time that I've been returning these documents to family members. The back of this card doesn't belong to Rabbi Lister's mother. The back of this card actually belongs to a refugee who came and was actually sent to Wales. And I think you can see there are a number of different addresses. And it really brings home that these refugees didn't just arrive and settle in and continue their lives as normal. These refugees came over, and very often they were still continuing their journey many years later. They were moved from pillar to post. They were living at different addresses. They might be in hostels or with different families. They might be moving for work as well. And I think it demonstrates just how difficult a time many of the refugees would have had when they came over. It wasn't a secure place. They were obviously safe, but it wasn't an easy life. I wanted to talk about some of the Kindertransport records that we have specifically. And I know that the synagogue put on a beautiful exhibition for the Kindertransport Shabbat, and many of these stories might have been in there. So this is actually one of my favorite stories from all the ones that I've heard through our archive documents. Annie Knecht was Sandy Potashnik's mother, and she arrived at the age of 14. And this is the document. It says requires no visa, and this is what the children brought in lieu of having a passport and a visa. And very often these documents are the earliest picture that people have of their relatives who came over. So it's this beautiful picture of Annie. It gives Gelsenkirchen as her place of birth. It gives sometimes it gives the address that they came from, the names of their parents as well. And then on the back, it gives the stamps. And most often you see that the children arrived in Harwich or in Southampton, and it gives the date of arrival. And this one you'll see, the immigration officer, she actually arrived in London, and the date is the 14th of February, 1939. And Sandy, when she came, she told me that her grandfather used to celebrate Valentine's Day very exuberantly. And they never really understood why until they realized that it was the date that she had arrived, that his wife had arrived in the UK. It was a day that she was saved. This is a wonderful story of Robert Goldschmidt. And a couple of years ago, after the Brexit referendum, and lots of people were wondering about the future in the UK and whether they should start looking for other passports. And a man who lives in rural Oxfordshire called Ian went online one day, and all he knew about his father was that he was German and he was Jewish. And the two things that had given it away were, the first was that, he didn't realize that his dad spoke with a thick German accent, because you never really realize that your parents have an accent until someone points it out to you. So they were, I think, traveling in Kenya, and two German tourists come up to his father and ask him a question in German, and he replies in fluent German. And Ian's there a bit gobsmacked as a 14-year-old thinking, I didn't know you could do that. And then he says that his father, for some reason, used to make him sit down and watch Holocaust documentaries when he was very young, and he could never understand why. So his father had died, and he was looking for information, and he went online and he found that our archives existed, and he thought, okay, well, it's worth a try. And he discovered through our archives that his father was Robert Goldschmidt. He had come over from Germany with his brother Salomon, And they had arrived on the very first Kindertransport that arrived in the UK on the 2nd of December 1938. He discovered that these two boys had been put into a children's home because their father was unable to look after them. Their mother had died. Their father had got together with a woman who was not Jewish, and he was put under immense pressure. And so the boys were put into a children's home, and they were some of the first they were the first ones to be brought over, because when the Kindertransport was established, it happened so quickly that they wanted really to get the children out as fast as possible. And the children in the children's home were the easiest to relocate. Since discovering that his father came on the Kindertransport, Ian has also discovered that he had a bunch of relatives he didn't know about. He's also been able to find the graves of his family in Germany and to lay Stolperstein for them. And more extraordinarily, he cycled 600 miles from Berlin to London in June last year to commemorate 80 years since the Kindertransport. But a bit more on that later. So this is an example of the case files. So once you have the registration card, we then go searching through the archives, obviously digitally, for the case files. And these can hold all sorts of information. Sometimes they are beautifully handwritten and sometimes they're typed. But the amount of information that's stored on these case files can be extraordinary. Not in a bad way, but it can sometimes be quite officious language for a very personal experience. So you can see that, again, it gives the names. The Jewish Refugees Committee referred to the committee within the CBF that was handling the social welfare of the refugees who were here. You can see the nationality. Sometimes it's German, as expected. Sometimes because they had been born in Poland, they're suddenly Polish or they're stateless. It gives, again, the date of arrival, the address in Germany, where they came from, and it gives just short descriptions about. So Annie called to answer my letter. So it gives kind of a description of what went on between the people at the CBF and the refugees. Very often what happened with the Kindertransport children is that our documents don't cover the time that they were living with the families. What happened was that the CBF became an organisation that could help people with money if they needed for rent, if they needed a suit or some clothes, they would help with that. There are ledgers that detail the loans that were given and when people paid them back. And also we helped with training so that people could get employment, because even people who came over here with a professional career very often were not able to practice as lawyers or doctors because the professional organisations in the UK wouldn't allow them to do so. So when they're about 15, 16, and they are going to have to start getting into the workplace and earning their own money and supporting themselves, that's when they would have come back under the care of the CBF. So very often you find for the older kids it was around kind of 1940, 41, 42, and for the younger kids maybe kind of around 44, 45. But these amazing documents, these amazing details were kept. Miss Smith, who must have been the busiest social worker in London, would visit these children and she would keep a record. So Miss Smith visited, very good home, girl very shy and reserved, but seems very happy. Hostess says headmaster at school speaks well of girl, of quite good health, looks pale and thin, but hostess reports girl eats and sleeps well and was never ill. Now, obviously, there are circumstances where the girl doesn't look so well, or the house is a bit messy, or the situation is not best. And in those circumstances, you see that they would do their best to move them out and to make sure that they were looked after. Again, with the training. So this is a boy who came over, and when he gets to about 15 or 16, we help him to get training as a motor mechanic. And when his three sons in their 40s and 50s came to pick up his documents, they had to smile at this, because not only did he train as a mechanic and went to work on in a garage, but he ended up owning the garage, which was situated on the site that JW3 now stands on the Finchley Road. So they could see all the way back to the fact that the CBF had helped him get into the motor trade at such a young age. He was called Siegfried, and the other astonishing thing was that his parents survived Theresienstadt, and it's documented in the files as well. Again, in a little bit of an officious manner, Mr. Rupin met Siegfried at Mrs. Landau's. He's in very good health, quite satisfied with his work, very happy at having heard from his parents from Theresienstadt through a very recent letter. And at this point, these three grown men look visibly shaken. It's not that they didn't know that their grandparents had survived Theresienstadt. It was that here was document proof of how their father discovered that. And they were so pleased that he would have known at such a kind of, so soon after the war that they would have survived. And to them, that was a huge relief because he died quite young and they didn't have a chance to talk to him about these things. And here was something that they could work out about the past through the documents that they would never have known about. The other one was a boy called Otto who had come over, and it was a not quite as happy a story. Otto phones to say that he has heard from an uncle, his father's brother, that Otto's father, mother and sister died in an extermination camp. Boy naturally very distressed, but bearing up with the sad news quite sensibly. It's just 4 lines, but it tells you a huge amount. These children had come from generally middle class or upper class backgrounds. They had lived very sheltered, very secured lives in Berlin, in Vienna, in other towns and cities across Germany and Austria. And suddenly, they were in Britain with no family support and no parents and no boundaries, and not all the stories ended up well. And for every wonderful person who has made an outstanding contribution to British life, there is the story of another person who suffered from mental ill health, who felt that they had been abused when they lived with a family but could never speak about it, who didn't realize that there were 10,000 other children in the same situation as them until they were 50 or 60 years old and went to a Kindertransport reunion, who didn't decide to stay Jewish because they lost all faith, and an astonishing number who died very young. And it's something that comes out again and again when people contact us, that my father always suffered from depression and died in his 50s or 60s, or my mother was always sad. And I think those are the stories that we don't hear about often enough, because it was traumatic. It was an incredible rescue mission. But did it do enough? Should we have brought over the families as well? Should the British government have opened the doors to their parents and not just allowed the children in? We talk about it in glowing terms, but I think what the documents bring out are some of the stories that have remained hidden for a very long time. Girls who have unexpected pregnancies or unwanted pregnancies, engagements to unsuitable soldiers that are broken off. Lots of bits and pieces, like they couldn't stick with a job, or they couldn't stay in the household because they were disruptive. But I think overall, people have been just astonished at the sort of information that they can get from these documents. And they really do bring family history to life. I think a word about the CBF. So the Central British Fund had all these people with very little family support, and the CBF became their family. So Lord Gorrell became the guardian for all the children in the middle of the war, and so any Kindertransport child that wanted to get married had to have the approval of Lord Gorrell, and on the whole he approved, but very often, sometimes he said no, they're unsuitable. And the CBF also was invited to bar mitzvahs, like this one, invitation to bar mitzvah at Bayswater Synagogue received. To boy, bar mitzvah letter with congratulations enclosing book of Jewish thoughts and Holy Scripture, and as any good bar mitzvah boy would do, he writes a thank you letter as well. Because you do, the CBF are like your family. This one is a wonderful young lady who came over, has a boyfriend, British Jewish, Now in Egypt, who is apparently very fond of her, cinema tickets sent. We would send lots of cinema tickets. We also invited them to parties to get to know each other. We made sure that they were getting religious instruction. We made sure that they had tickets to attend High Holy Day services in synagogues. It was very important to the CBF that they retain their Jewish identity. And wherever was possible, they ensured that they had Jewish education or some sort of Jewish social life to keep them involved with the community. This one, invitation to Rosie's wedding on June the 8th. Letter of congratulation to girl and regrets cannot accept invitation to wedding. What was astonishing about Rosie's story is that her granddaughter is a Rebbetzin at United Synagogue in London. And she had said to me, oh, my grandmother came on the Kindertransport. And I said, well, you should come in and have a look at our files, see if we have anything on her. Not only did we have this on her grandmother, but she said, oh, my grandmother came with her two sisters. So we look for the two sisters and we find files and documents on them. And then it turns out that her two sisters got married to men who had also come from Germany and Austria, and we had details on them. And then it turns out that the parents and the grandparents also came. And seriously, by the time she left our offices, she had files for about 12 members of her family and was weighed down like this. It was amazing. You come looking for one, and you find lots more. It wasn't just children on the Kindertransport for whom we have documents. We have documents for refugees who came of all ages and for all reasons. Women, young women who came as domestic servants, older people who were able to come, a lot of people who might have lied a little bit about their profession as well. And that's always an interesting one when someone comes in and sees and says, no, I don't ever remember them being a leather tanner. But that's what got them into Britain. We've done a short video about some of the people who we've returned archived documents to. And I know that you'll hear from Rabbi Lister just after I finish speaking, but I thought that you might like to see this too.
For decades, World Jewish Relief's case files were lost and forgotten, until a chance discovery revealed a treasure trove of documents detailing the extraordinary help the charity gave to Jews fleeing the Nazis. Now we're returning these documents to families, revealing some fascinating details.
This is what we have on your father.
Was it all his dresses?
Yeah, these are all the places that he lived.
27, wow, we've moved a lot. It's quite interesting because whenever we drive around London, my father always seems to say, I live there, I live there.
Moshe Nertman is one of the boys, a group of 732 concentration camp survivors brought to the UK by World Jewish Relief.
Hi Dad.
Yeah.
It says you were very tough, liked and respected by others. It's rather obstinate. That's a good description. And you couldn't read or write when you came over.
No,
And you taught yourself to read and write, didn't you?
naturally.
You're quite a life, Dad.
The files are incredible. Every time we open one, we're blown away with the level of detail.
Like the files of Hannah and her brother Gerald, who came on the Kindertransport.
I learned something about my brother. I knew he'd had a much more difficult time than I had. There are two photographs. One is of him looking like a nice, chubby-looking little boy. And then I think only a few days later, the one was taken of him, and he looks really sad. He's got those very sad doggy eyes suddenly. And I don't think I was so aware of that, and that's what brought it home again.
The girl seems perfectly satisfied with her surroundings. Yes, she was.
Twins George and Peter Summerfield were 6 years old when their family fled Berlin.
So on this page you can see some details, which is that presumably you didn't have very much. So on the 12th of the 11th, 1940, you were provided with one blanket, a suitcase and 2 socks, 2 vests, 2 pants.
Really?
2 socks,
Really?
2 vests, 2 pants. So you each got...
We arrived in England just with our hand luggage. Everything else had been stolen. We really had very little indeed. And so this was marvellous to know that someone was looking after us like this.
really grateful to World Jewish Relief for keeping this stuff and making it available to us.
It's a reminder of all sorts of things. It's such a tribute, I think, to our parents. And, I'm very grateful. I really am very grateful that I was given the opportunity to have them.
Contact us to find out if we have your family record.
So how does our history impact on what we do now? Well, it does in all sorts of ways. We are the British Jewish Community's Humanitarian Response Agency. We care for the most vulnerable Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. People who were very often evacuated during the war to places like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and came back to Ukraine and were moved from one city to another and had to hide their Judaism during Soviet time. And then with the fall of communism, saw their pensions completely disappear. And these people are living incredibly tough lives. And I think there was just one experience that I had when I last went out to Ukraine that I wanted to tell you about. I went into a very dark stairway. And once you close the door, it's almost impossible to see. The stairs are all uneven, the handrail is broken at times, and I made my way up 9 flights of stairs because I didn't want to take the lift, I didn't trust it. And I get to the top and I walk into this flat, and it is warm and inviting, and around the table are seated 10 older Ukrainian women. And they are all doing arts and crafts, and they're having something to eat and drink, and they're socializing. And I go round and I ask them, well, what did you work as? Kind of give me a bit of background about who you are. And as we go round, they were heads of industry, they were professors, they were scientists, they were engineers on construction sites. These were incredibly powerful, intelligent women who had worked for the Soviet regime all their lives, and in their retirement were living in the most squalid, awful conditions, unable to heat their homes, unable to feed themselves properly. And they were at something called a warm home, which is something that World Jewish Relief organizes in these communities in Eastern Europe. And it enables people to get out of their homes, to escape the debilitating loneliness and isolation that older people can very often feel. We help these women to come to this flat once every 2 weeks. We make sure that they have an activity. We make sure that there is food for them to enjoy as well. And this might be the one time that they get to socialize and talk to people. It might be the one time that they get out of their flats and their homes. And it's just one of the very small ways that we help these people. We have the most phenomenal dementia workshops where we're training people across Eastern Europe, not just about how to work with people with dementia, but what is dementia? Because dementia just is not understood in Eastern Europe. And World Jewish Relief is pioneering that in Eastern Europe. We help people have cataract operations, an incredibly simple, relatively cheap operation, which can change people's lives. But for years and years, they have lived unable to see properly, unable to read, unable to get out of their flats because they couldn't afford this operation. And we help them to have these operations. We make sure that people who are unable to leave their homes receive the home care that they need to live dignified lives. We make sure that if there is an 85-year-old woman living in conditions where she's still having to go outside to use the toilet, that we repair her home so that she can have a toilet inside the house, that she can have a bathroom which isn't at risk of falling apart, and she can have a kitchen which is suitable to live in dignity and to support herself. These are the amazing things that we're doing across Eastern Europe. We also help people with livelihoods. So we don't want the younger generation to suffer the same crippling poverty. And we're doing incredibly well. We're helping younger people to get back into the workplace or to set up their own businesses and to support themselves and their families so that their families don't have to live in squalor and don't have to live in poverty. And we also do this in the countries around the world where we respond to international disasters. So whether that might be the earthquake in Haiti, whether it's responding to the refugee crisis. And the reason that we do this is not just because we are Jewish, and because we should care not just for our own community, not just for the Jewish community in other parts of the world, but also because we are members of a global humanity. We have a responsibility to also support people who are not just part of our own family, and to show other people that we care. And the reason that we support livelihoods and that we have made expertise in this area is because of what Maimonides calls the highest level of charity. Don't just give someone money, give them the loan or the ability to set up their own business and support themselves. And this is what we're doing across Eastern Europe and across the countries where we respond to international crises. Now, there are two things that I want to leave you with. Number one, if you or any of your family came over from Eastern Europe in the 1930s or 40s and you have not yet accessed our archives, please go to www.worldjewishRelief.org/archives and fill in an inquiry form. We may not have anything, but we may have something. And it could make all the difference to you and your family in understanding a part of your family history. And even if you don't have family who came over in the 1930s or 40s, please take a leaflet. And the next time that you're talking to someone and they say, oh, my father came on the Kindertransport, or my grandfather came over in 1930s, then say, oh, have you heard of World Jewish Relief's archives? And give them one of these. That would be great. I mentioned about the Berlin to London bike ride. So in June last year, we commemorated 80 years since the Kindertransport with a bike ride of 600 miles over 6 days. And we had 42 people taking part, and a large number of them were relatives of someone who had come on the Kindertransport. And we also had one man who himself was a kind, and he cycled with his son and his grandson the 600 miles. And it was a phenomenal experience. We're doing it just one last time because the Kindertransport went from 38 to 39. So in June 2019 will be the last time that we do this bike ride. And it would be incredibly poignant if anyone who has relatives who came over and has a keen cyclist in the family would like to take part. Then please, there are also leaflets at the back there. I'd just like to thank you so much for inviting me this evening, and I'd love to welcome Rabbi Lister to tell us about his mother's experience.
My story begins with Alfred Lefkowitz, who was a Jewish man born in Poland in the late 1800s. He moved to Germany before the First World War, and as the story goes, when Jewish people came en masse from Poland and Russia to Germany to escape the pogroms, the German peasants in the fields would straighten up from their labors as they saw these trains full of Jews, and they would shout to them, "Jetzt sind Sie frei," which means, "Now you are free." In those days, Germany was a haven of tolerance, culture, and civilization, and all the wonderful values that people like Schiller, Goethe, and Kant would espouse and promulgate. Alfred Lefkowitz was a remarkable man. He was something of a Torah scholar. He was a chemistry teacher. He used to take his pupils around in the mountains around Berlin where he taught, to show them interesting plants, wildlife, cloud formations, geological formations. He was a very clever man. He rode a motorbike, and he also played the violin. He also, in the First World War, fought in the Prussian army for Germany. And it was then that he won the Iron Cross. And here's a picture of some Iron Crosses, and not necessarily the one that he won, but it looked something like this. Alfred Lefkowitz was Jewish, and in the early 1930s he married Hildegard Lublin, who, like him, had originally come to Germany from Poland. The marriage almost didn't happen, A, because he was something of a bachelor type, and B, because he overslept on his wedding day, and only got there on time because his landlady thundered on the door and said, "Alfred, get up, you need to get married." He settled in Germany, in Berlin, with his new wife, and they had a baby, Eva, and she was born in 1935. In 1938, it was, as we heard before, Kristallnacht, and Alfred Lefkowitz came home very shaken and said to his wife Hildegard, "Die Synagoge brennt," the shul is burning. And this, of course, is one of many pictures with which we're all too familiar, of the shuls across Germany and Austria burning on that terrible night. Shortly after Kristallnacht, there was a knock at the door. The Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, came and arrested Alfred Lefkowitz and took him to Sachsenhausen, which was a concentration camp nearest to Berlin. Here you see the roll call in Sachsenhausen. There were thousands of prisoners, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and Jews, mainly Jews. And if you look in this next picture here, you can just about see they had terrible living conditions. They were cold, they were hungry, they were exhausted, and of course they were frightened. And they had to work extremely hard. Here you see them pulling some kind of wagon, wearing this demeaning prison uniform. These are people who'd done nothing wrong except being Jewish. They weren't criminals, they weren't disruptive in any way. They were good citizens who cared about German values and did their best for German society. But nonetheless, the Nazi madness led to this kind of thing. Alfred's wife, Hildegard, was of course distraught with worry about the fact that her husband had been carted off to this concentration camp. The police who'd taken him away had told her where they were taking him, but that was that. And as the days turned into weeks and there was still no word from him, she realized she had to act. She had to do something to rescue her husband. So she got hold of her husband's Iron Cross, which he'd won in the First World War. And she got on a train with her little baby on her arm, wrapped up against the cold of the German winter. And they went to the main gate at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. And here's a picture of it. It didn't look quite like this. This is as the prisoners, as you can see, were going home, going back to the camp at the end of the day when they'd been working out of the camp. On the time when Hildegard came to the concentration camp, she could see the head of the camp, the commandant, standing by this gate, and he was surrounded by women, some of whom were on their knees, some were beating their breasts, tearing their hair, all distraught and begging and pleading and shouting and screaming and crying for their relatives to be released. Hildegard Lefkowitz was a tough cookie. You didn't mess with her. She was very brave. And she approached the commandant of the camp. Here he is, Hermann Baranowski, SS Oberführer, with his SS skull and crossbones on his cap. And he was the commandant at the time. And there he was at the gate, surrounded by these screaming women, with his gun at his belt and armed guards at his side. And Hildegard Lefkowitz marched up to this man. She was only a little lady. And she fixed him with her bright blue eyes and produced her husband's Iron Cross and shoved it in his face and said to him, "This is what my husband did for your country. You shouldn't be keeping him in here." And for a moment there was quiet, because it was an incredibly intemperate and daring thing to do, to accuse this SS commandant, who was renowned for his terrible cruelty, of being unfair. And yet he looked down on this little Jewish lady with a baby on her arm and a yellow star on her coat and said to her, "I respect that. You're not like these other women, you have courage. What's your husband's name? So she looked up at him and said, Alfred Lefkowitz. And he turned to one of the guards and said, bring me Alfred Lefkowitz. A few minutes later, out he came, and he said, you may go free. And incredibly, she walked off from this camp back to the train, back home, with her husband, whom she just rescued because of the Iron Cross and her own incredible courage. When they got back home, Alfred said to her, we need to go. It's desperately urgent. We must go now. He'd seen enough. He never wanted to speak about what exactly he'd been through, but he knew it was time to leave. So they got little Eva onto a Kindertransport, onto one of these amazing trains, and she came to the UK. She was only 4 at the time. She had barely any idea of where she was going or what was going on. But on the train she came, and this is one of the CBF trains that she organised, and on the 2nd of April 1939, she came to Southampton. I only found out when she came to Southampton because of World Jewish Relief. I think it was Sandy who mentioned to me that there was this scheme of sending people archives, and I'm the kind of person who writes off and never gets a response. It never works for me. But I thought I'd give it a try. It was only an email. So I sent off the form with the details, forgot all about it, and a few weeks later, there it was, my mother's documents. And I saw this picture of my mother, and it was incredibly moving, aged nearly 4. And she looked just like my daughter Leora at the same age, with burning brown eyes and masses of thick, dark, bushy hair. I don't know where Leora gets it from. Any of you who've seen my daughter Leora, you'll know what my mum looked like at that age, because the resemblance is quite remarkable. And there's a stamp on the visa which says, leave to land granted at Southampton this day on condition that the holder does not enter any employment, paid or unpaid, while in the UK. Well, my mum was not yet 4, though she was very clever. She wasn't quite ready to be employed at that stage, so that wasn't a worry in the short term. Alfred and Hildegard Lefkowitz, incredibly, did get out. Alfred went to the Kitchener camp, and just very recently I looked this up, and I found not only this picture of the camp, but I also found a record of my grandpa. There he is, Alfred Lefkowitz, born in 1894, and he was actually in the camp. And for me, it made it kind of real to see that there was this official record of him with all these other people, and how he was kept safe there in this relatively welcoming environment. And after the horrors of Sachsenhausen, for him it was an absolute palace. I also found out from the World Jewish Relief documentation about my mum where they lived. They moved to Derby. Now, I knew they'd moved to Derby, but I didn't know what life was like in Derby until I saw this document which said that they lived in a place called Mount Street in Derby. So I did a Google Street View on Mount Street, and here's the kind of house that my mum lived in. She lived at number 14. Number 14 isn't there anymore. It's been demolished, and it's now a building site for redevelopment. But it's clear that there's a whole row of terrace houses that stop abruptly at the building site. So this is the sort of house that she lived in. And if you look carefully at the front doors, you can see there's a white one and a black one, and then a bit further to the right, number 24 there, the black one. And you see how small these houses were. They were tiny. And they weren't even semi-detached. They were just one long terrace. And my mum told me when she was growing up in Derby, she was never hungry, but she was often cold. She had chilblains from the cold because they were very poor. And the neighbours were very rough. It was a down-at-heel, disreputable neighbourhood, because that was all they could afford. And this also gave me an insight into my mother's character and my own, because whenever my mother received the slightest kind of treat, she was overjoyed. You got lots of bang for your buck when you gave my mum a present. She would take off the wrapping paper and put it somewhere safe, because she couldn't bear to throw it away and she wanted to bring it out again and appreciate it. She used to make displays out of fruit she got from the supermarket. She said, look at this beautiful fruit bowl, isn't it lovely? And I've inherited this from her because of the way she brought me up, that I can find pleasure in the smallest things. And I'm always going around turning off lights because my kids call me the Prince of Darkness, because this is how I was brought up, because she was brought up in a place like this. And I understood this aspect of my own character from that little detail in the World Jewish Relief documentation. As my mum got a bit older, she went to Homeland School in Derby, which is a comprehensive school, but about as posh as a comprehensive school gets. And you can just imagine how she felt the first day she went to this school and walked to this long driveway to this imposing building at the end. She barely spoke the language. She was German. Her parents spoke German at home. And even in later life, I remember that occasionally she would say a phrase in German, and her German was superb. But her English was, even when I knew her, ever so slightly shaky. And sometimes her word order would go all to pot. So I remember once my father found it rather amusing when she wanted to say that a certain shop hadn't sold fish for years. And she said, they don't sell fish already since years, which is the German, Sie verkaufen schon seit Jahren nicht mehr Fisch. And this is how her German, her Holocaust heritage came out a little bit. And going to Homelands, it was difficult for her, but the burning brown eyes in her picture in the in the documentation of her arrival here really told you a bit about her personality, which helped me understand a couple of anecdotes about her when she was here. When she came here, they had to have a school scarf, which had a particular design of certain stripes and colours on it. And they couldn't afford the scarf. So her mother knitted a scarf for her in the same colours, but it clearly was a homemade scarf instead of the proper school one. And on the first day, this very strict teacher shouted at my mother and said, Lee, well, they called them by their surnames, Lee, where's your school scarf? And my mother said, this is all I have. And she said, why haven't you got the proper scarf? And my mother said, we can't afford one. And in Derby, in this school, they were bourgeois enough to know that you never spoke the P word, which was poor. And my mother spoke it. Nonetheless, she did very well in school, so much so that they wanted to make her head girl. Now, she didn't have much Jewish education because Derby wasn't known for its Jewish schools network. But she knew she was Jewish, and there was a tiny little shul that they went to from time to time. And there was a cheder that met occasionally in a room in a church school nearby. And when they wanted to make her head girl because she'd worked so hard and done so well, that would have meant her leading the Christian prayers. She declined the honor of being head girl because it would have meant leading the Christian prayers. She said, I can't do that, I'm Jewish. So they made a deputy instead, which is not bad. So I learnt a lot from the World Jewish Relief documentation, not only about her story, but also about myself. And you see your parents in yourself, and especially if you have children of your own, you hear your parents coming out when you speak to your own kids. And now I hear my mum coming out in me when I talk to my children. And also when I speak to my sister, I do these things as well. That's me. I'm my mother's son. And you wouldn't know it from looking at the picture, but I actually look very much like her, especially the top of my face. And there's a couple of further gifts that my mum gave to me that I want to show you. One is something I got behind, and one is the last picture I'm going to keep right to the very end. If you just bear with me a second. I mentioned that my late grandfather played the violin. This is his violin. And my mum ensured that I learned to play the violin. And when I could get a couple of notes out of it, she gave me his violin. And so this is the violin that he managed to spirit away out of Germany when he came. And I wanted to play it for you because I think it will give my mum a lot of pleasure to hear me practice occasionally. I'll try and do a full bow, mum, all right? And also because I like to think when I play it that Alfred Lefkowitz, my grandpa, whom I never met, could not have possibly imagined when he was in Sachsenhausen that one day there'd be a song that everybody knew celebrating the Jewish return to a rebuilt Jerusalem. That would have seemed utterly fantastical to him as he was shivering and scared in Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Yet here we are, and there it is. So I want to play this song of hope on his violin for him and for my mum. The best gift that my grandfather, my grandmother, and my mother and my father gave to me was life itself. I've had the most fantastic life, and I thank both my parents and my grandparents for helping me, and together with the Almighty, who's more than a bit player in all of this, to get to this stage. And it's given me great pleasure to be able to hand on this message of hope and life to the next generation. And I want to finish off with my last picture. Some of you will recognize these children. These are our children, Rachel's and my children. And this picture means an especial amount to me. You wouldn't know to look at it, but it's actually a bench in Primrose Hill Park. And it was on this bench that I proposed to Rachel nearly 25 years ago. And we decided that we'd take the kids there and say, look what happened as a result of my, for once, doing the brave thing on that bench. So I thank my parents, my grandparents, especially my grandma and the Almighty, for all that they did for us. I thank World Jewish Relief and the CBF as it was there for helping me, Sheikh Yonah for bringing me to this time with the Almighty's help. And with this message of hope and generosity and kindness, may we all walk into the future with a straighter back and a light in our eyes. Thank you all very much.
I do want to ask, have you made an inquiry for your grandfather? Because the CBF were the ones who arranged for the men to come from Sachsenhausen and Bergen-Belsen to the Kitchener camp. And it was established by the CBF as one of the places to enable men to come to, because when they left the concentration camps, they were threatened that if they were arrested again, if they were found in Germany and they didn't leave, that they would be rearrested. And that spelt kind of a certain doom for them. So the CBF were actually the ones who arranged the Kitchener camp. So will you do me a favour and send me his details? I'll have a look. Excellent.
I think tonight we've seen World Jewish Relief at its best, showing what we can do for other Jews, not only now, but what was done in the past, Jews helping each other throughout the world. It's a pity that Sandy Potashnik wasn't here tonight, because Marilyn and I knew her mother, Annie. They were among the first people who invited us for a kiddush and a meal when we first moved into Wembley. And that, I think, shows the sort of people that arrived on the Kindertransport, how they helped other people in this country also. Later in the year, I'm hoping that we do have somebody come to talk to us who came on the Kindertransport, rose to dizzy heights, and later tried tracing all the people who were in his class in Vienna, but more of that later. I'd like to thank Rebecca Singer and Rabbi Lister for a most illuminating and interesting evening. I'd like to thank World Jewish Relief for coming along tonight and for telling us about their work. We will, of course, give a donation to the organisation. And I hope that you'll take much more interest than you have in the past in World Jewish Relief, and maybe you can help them in some way. So thank you all for coming tonight.